Chapter 1. Meet Dr. Dave. Dr. Dave is a very nice doctor. He is tall and has curly brown hair. He wears glasses because he likes to read. Patients are the people who come to see him when they are not feeling well. Dr. Dave works in a small, blue office. The office is in a small town. It is near a bakery and a flower shop. You can smell the bread and the flowers every morning. The office has a red door. When you open the door, you see a small waiting room. In the waiting room, there are colorful pictures on the walls. There are also toys for children. Dr. Dave knows some children get sad when they visit a doctor, so he has some toys to make them happier. There are also magazines on a small table. People read them while they wait for Dr. Dave. Dr. Dave's room is next to the waiting room. In his room, there is a big desk. On the desk, there are many papers and pens. There is also a funny picture of a cat wearing glasses. Dr. Dave likes cats. He has a cat named Whiskers. Whiskers stays at home, though. Dr. Dave usually wears a white coat, but sometimes he wears a colorful shirt. He likes to be comfortable. He talks to people about their problems. He listens very carefully. Listening is very important for a doctor. He also gives them medicine or advice to make them feel better. Dr. Dave lives near his office. He walks to work every day. He likes to walk. He says it is good for his heart. When he gets to his office, he always says good morning to everyone. He is a very friendly doctor. Many people like Dr. Dave. Chapter 2. A strange case. One sunny morning, a lady comes to Dr. Dave's office. Her name is Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins is an older lady with gray hair and kind eyes. She wears a purple dress and a big hat with flowers on it. Mrs. Higgins sits in the waiting room quietly. She looks a little worried. Dr. Dave calls her name. Mrs. Higgins, please come in. She walks into his room slowly. Good morning, Mrs. Higgins. What brings you here today? Says Dr. Dave with a smile. His smile is very big and friendly. Good morning, Dr. Dave, says Mrs. Higgins. Her voice is a little weak. I have a very strange problem. Dr. Dave is curious. Oh, what is it? He asks, leaning forward. He is ready to listen. Mrs. Higgins takes a deep breath. Well, Dr. Dave, it's about my marmalade. Dr. Dave raises his eyebrows. His eyebrows go up on his face. Marmalade? What about your marmalade? Marmalade is a type of jam. It is sweet and sticky and made from oranges. It's gone, Dr. Dave. My marmalade is missing, Mrs. Higgins says, sounding sad. Dr. Dave blinks. He is a little surprised. Most people come to him because they have a cold or a tummy ache, not because their food is missing. He is intrigued. Missing? Tell me everything, Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins tells him her story. She says she made a new group of marmalade yesterday. It was a very big batch. She put it in a big jar. She left the jar on her kitchen table. This morning, she went to have some marmalade for her breakfast, but the jar was empty. Dr. Dave listens carefully. He can see that Mrs. Higgins is really upset. He has a case to solve, and this case is about marmalade. Okay, Mrs. Higgins, I want to help understand what happened to your marmalade. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. Dr. Dave puts his pen down on his desk. He looks at Mrs. Higgins. Okay, Mrs. Higgins, let's think about this like a detective story. Detectives solve mysteries. I will ask you some questions. Mrs. Higgins nods. She is ready to help. First, says Dr. Dave, where was the marmalade when you last saw it? Was it in a special place? Yes, says Mrs. Higgins. It was on the kitchen table. It was in a very big jar. A very, very big jar. Did you lock your door last night? asks Dr. Dave. Yes, young man. I always lock my door. I do it every night, Mrs. Higgins says. Did anyone else have the key to your house? He asks. Mrs. Higgins thinks for a moment. She taps her chin with her finger. No, only me, she replies. Dr. Dave writes things on a piece of paper. He writes, marmalade on kitchen table, door locked, no other key. Was there anyone else in the house with you last night? Dr. Dave asks. No, it was just me and my cat, Mittens, replies Mrs. Higgins. Mittens is a very small cat. She would never eat marmalade, Dr. Dave thinks. A cat probably would not eat a whole jar of marmalade. He asks, did you see anything unusual when you went to get your marmalade this morning? Well, there was a spoon next to the empty jar. It was a very big spoon, a serving spoon. Mrs. Higgins says. Dr. Dave writes, big spoon near the empty jar. He makes a note, unusual. He knows this is an important clue. He looks at Mrs. Higgins. Okay, Mrs. Higgins, I have an idea. Maybe we should go to your house and see if we can find any other clues. Would that be okay? Mrs. Higgins' face lights up. Oh, yes, Dr. Dave. That is a wonderful idea. So, Dr. Dave and Mrs. Higgins leave the office. They walk to Mrs. Higgins' house. They are now detectives working on a big marmalade mystery. Chapter 4. Clues and Confusions. Dr. Dave and Mrs. Higgins arrive at her house. It is a pretty little house with a garden full of flowers. They go inside. The kitchen is sunny and bright. Dr. Dave looks around. There is a big wooden table in the middle of the room. It's very clean, except for a few sticky spots near the middle. Dr. Dave sees a big serving spoon on the table, just like Mrs. Higgins described. Okay, so the marmalade was on this table, right? Dr. Dave asks. Yes, right here, says Mrs. Higgins, pointing to the middle of the table. Dr. Dave walks towards the table and looks closely. He sees a few small orange marks on the table. They are very sticky. These look like marmalade. But where is the jar? Mrs. Higgins shrugs her shoulders. I don't know. I looked everywhere. It is not here. Dr. Dave walks toward the floor and takes a closer look. He finds some orange footprints on the floor. They are small and look like the prints of small paws. Very small. Oh, he says. I think I know who might have taken the marmalade. Mrs. Higgins looks confused. Mittens? But she is a small cat. She could not eat all that marmalade. Dr. Dave smiles. It is not Mittens. Look at these footprints. They are very small. They look like mouse footprints. Mrs. Higgins looks down. She sees them now too. Oh my goodness, she says. Are you saying a mouse ate all my marmalade? Dr. Dave is not sure, but he says, maybe. That is what the clues suggest. He points to a small hole in the wall near the floor. And look, there is a small hole near table. Maybe the mouse used that hole to get into the kitchen. Mrs. Higgins is surprised. I never saw that hole before. But can a mouse eat a whole jar of marmalade? Dr. Dave scratches his head. Well, that is a big question. But we know there are mouse footprints and a mouse hole, he says. This is a very strange story. Chapter 5. The Marmalade Mystery. Dr. Dave looks around the kitchen. He is trying to imagine what happened last night. He looks at the table where the marmalade was. He looks at the spoon. He looks at the floor with the tiny footprints. Mrs. Higgins, Dr. Dave says, was the jar of marmalade open? Did you close it? Oh, I remember now, says Mrs. Higgins. I didn't close the lid on the jar. It was late and I was sleepy. I just left it open. Dr. Dave nods. Okay, that is a clue. An open jar is an invitation to a mouse. he says with a small smile. This case is getting more and more interesting. He looks at the big serving spoon. And this big spoon, did you use it to take some marmalade before? No, that spoon was in the drawer. I never take marmalade with that spoon, she replies. Dr. Dave thinks, maybe the mouse used the spoon. But how could a mouse use such a big spoon? They look at the mouse hole again. It is very small, just big enough for a tiny mouse to fit through. Dr. Dave says, I think we need to think like a mouse. Why would a mouse come out of the hole? And why would a mouse want marmalade? Mrs. Higgins is quiet for a moment. Then she says, I think my house needs a good cleaning. I keep some food in the cupboard. Maybe there are some crumbs that the mouse has been eating. Dr. Dave says, that is a great idea, Mrs. Higgins. But I think there is more to the story about the marmalade. I think it is time for another look. Dr. Dave moves slowly around the kitchen looking for clues. He puts on his extra powerful reading glasses and starts looking at the floor again. Mrs. Higgins is watching him very closely. She is curious to see what he will find. This is now an important case. Chapter 6. The Big Discovery. Dr. Dave looks very carefully. He is looking at the floor near the table. He sees something small and shiny. He bends down and picks it up. It is a very small piece of paper. It is sticky and it has orange on it. It looks like a label. Mrs. Higgins, Dr. Dave says, look at this. Does this look familiar? Mrs. Higgins puts on her glasses and looks at the small paper label. Oh my goodness, she says. I think this is the label for my marmalade jar. But how did it get here? Dr. Dave looks closely at the label. He sees some tiny tooth marks on the edges of the paper. I think the mouse was chewing on the label, he says, but that is not all. Dr. Dave turns the paper label over. On the back of the label, there are tiny letters. They are not written very well. They look like they were written quickly and messily. He holds the label up to the light. He can make out the words. They say, give me the marmalade. Dr. Dave looks at Mrs. Higgins. This is very strange. Very strange indeed. He says very slowly, this is not the work of a mouse. I think someone else was here last night. Someone who wanted your marmalade very badly. Someone who was not very good at writing. Mrs. Higgins is shocked. What? But who would want to steal my marmalade? Mrs. Higgins asks. Dr. Dave thinks for a moment. We have a clue, Mrs. Higgins, he says. This handwriting is not good. It is messy, and it is not from you. So, who do we know who is messy and has trouble writing? Mrs. Higgins thinks hard, and then her eyes light up. Oh, Dr. Dave, I think I know who it is. My neighbor, Timmy. He is a little boy, and he loves marmalade. He is not good at writing, and is always messy. He has a sweet tooth. Dr. Dave smiles. It seems like our big marmalade mystery is not so mysterious anymore. He says, I think we know who took the marmalade, but we must find out for sure. Chapter 7. A Happy Ending. Dr. Dave and Mrs. Higgins walk to Timmy's house. Timmy is a little boy with red hair and a big smile. He lives next door to Mrs. Higgins. Dr. Dave knocks on Timmy's door. Timmy's mom opens the door. Hello, what a surprise. Timmy's mom says, hello, says Dr. Dave. We have come to ask Timmy a question about marmalade. Timmy's mom calls for Timmy. Timmy walks to the door. He looks a little nervous. Timmy, says Dr. Dave with a gentle voice, did you take Mrs. Higgins' marmalade last night? Timmy looks down at his feet. He nods his head very slowly. Why did you take the marmalade, Timmy? Asks Dr. Dave. Because I love marmalade, says Timmy. I saw it on the table with the lid off, and I could not help myself. I waited until everyone was asleep, and then when it gets some, he starts to cry. Did you use the big spoon? Asks Dr. Dave. Timmy nods. Yes, I used the big spoon. And I wrote that note because I thought it would be funny. Oh, Timmy, says Mrs. Higgins with a gentle smile. You should have just asked me for some marmalade. I would have given it to you. Timmy looks up with big eyes. Really? Yes, really, says Mrs. Higgins. But you must learn to ask, not take. Timmy nods. Okay, he says. I am very, very sorry, Mrs. Higgins. I will never do it again. Mrs. Higgins laughs. It's okay, Timmy. I am happy you are not a mouse stealing all my marmalade. Dr. Dave and Mrs. Higgins go back to her house. Timmy's mother says that Timmy will now help Mrs. Higgins make a new batch of marmalade. Dr. Dave and Mrs. Higgins laugh. The marmalade mystery is solved. A small boy just wanted some marmalade, and now everyone is happy. Chapter 8. Dr. Dave's Day Off. After solving the marmalade mystery, Dr. Dave feels very happy. It was an unusual case, but he helped Mrs. Higgins, and that makes him feel good. Saturday is his day off. He does not work in the office on Saturdays. On Saturday mornings, Dr. Dave likes to go for a walk in the park. He enjoys looking at the green trees and listening to the birds sing. He walks with his cat, Whiskers. Whiskers wears a special harness and a leash so that he can go for walks. After the walk, Dr. Dave goes to the library. He loves to read books. He reads about science, history, and even funny stories. He likes to learn new things. Today, he borrows a book about the stars. He loves to learn about space. In the afternoon, Dr. Dave goes to the bakery. He buys a loaf of fresh bread and some cookies. He likes to support the local businesses. He knows that the baker works hard every day. He also gets a treat for Whiskers. He brings the bread and cookies home. He makes a sandwich and a cup of tea. He eats his lunch outside in his small garden. Whiskers sits next to him, purring softly, making a soft sound that cats make when they are happy. In the evening, Dr. Dave likes to watch a movie. He watches a funny movie. He laughs a lot. Laughter is good for your health, he says. After the movie, he reads his star book before going to bed. He enjoys his quiet and peaceful day. He is refreshed and ready for another week of helping people. Chapter 9. Another strange case? Monday morning comes quickly. Dr. Dave wakes up early and walks to his office. He is excited to see his patients. Today, he is wearing a blue shirt with small yellow ducks on it. He likes to show off his silly style. The first patient of the day is Mr. Peterson. Mr. Peterson is a tall man with a long beard. Dr. Dave has seen many patients with many problems, but this problem is a little different. Good morning, Dr. Dave, says Mr. Peterson. I came to you because, well, I have a very strange problem. Dr. Dave smiles. He is ready for anything. What is your problem, Mr. Peterson? He asks. Mr. Peterson looks around the room. He leans in very close and whispers, "My socks, they keep disappearing." Dr. Dave raises his eyebrows. Disappearing? He asks. What do you mean, disappearing? Mr. Peterson explains that every day he puts on a pair of clean socks, but by the end of the day, one of the socks is always missing. He says he looks everywhere, under the bed, in his shoes, in the washing machine, but he cannot find the missing socks. Dr. Dave is very curious. He asks Mr. Peterson some questions. Do you have a pet? Do you leave your socks in a special place? Do they start disappearing at a certain time? He writes everything down on his notepad. This is another mysterious case. Not about marmalade, but about missing socks. Dr. Dave says, Mr. Peterson, This is a very unusual problem. I want to help you find your missing socks. I think I might have to do a little bit of detective work. Would that be okay?" Mr. Peterson laughs. "Anything you can do, doctor," he says. Dr. Dave smiles. He loves a good mystery. He looks forward to working it out. It seems his small town is not as quiet as he thought. Chapter 10. Life with Dr. Dave. Dr. Dave is more than just a doctor. He is a friend to the people in his small town. He is always ready to help, whether it's a cold, a tummy ache, or a missing jar of marmalade. You can always count on Dr. Dave. He listens carefully to everyone. He cares about their problems. He makes people laugh, even when they are feeling sad. He is a very special doctor. The people in the town love Dr. Dave. They like his funny jokes. They like his colorful shirts. They trust him to make them feel better. They know that he is a good person. Dr. Dave's office is a happy place. Children are not scared to go to his office. They know that Dr. Dave will play with them. He will ask them about their day, and he will make them feel safe. He is also a good neighbor. He helps the people in his community make their small town a nice place to live. He always waves hello to people when he walks in the street, and is always there to help anyone in need. He has a good life. He has a loving cat, a good job, and he is always ready for a new adventure. He is a doctor, a detective, and a friend. He brings joy to his small town every day, and he can't wait to find out what happens next. Perhaps the mystery of the disappearing socks is